Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Since PureFlix seems to have been sponsoring my videos lately with a plethora of ads, I thought that it would be fitting if I did a response video to one of their videos. So, if you see a PureFlix ad on this one, then sleep soundly tonight knowing that PureFlix is paying me to show people what kind of nonsense they put out. This one is an interview with Bodie Hodge from Answers in Genesis. If you're familiar with Pelagia's Ham and Eggs news series, then you'll know Bodie as the logical fallacy guy. He is very quick to jump into any conversation and declare there to be a logical fallacy without actually understanding the fallacy. This video was a bit lengthy, so I've cut it down for time, but as always the link to the full video will be in the description, so feel free to go make sure that I didn't skip anything that would have completely destroyed my atheism. So let's go!
Okay, so one of the areas that you are very knowledgeable about is the Bible, obviously.
I love the Bible.
We all love the Bible. Now, not everybody loves the Bible, but we do as Christians.
Right.
And so one of the jobs we have is to defend the Bible, explain the Bible.
And right there, the fact that the job of defending and explaining the Bible even exists is kind of a refutation of the idea that the Bible is the infallible word of an omnipotent God. If God were omnipotent, he wouldn't need people to defend the perfect book that he wrote. It would be unassailable.
What is it, and we'll start here, for you that gives you confidence and faith in the Christian Bible?
Well, if we just start with God and His Word, there is no greater ultimate authority. God is the ultimate authority just by His very nature.
Okay, so you trust the Bible because you believe that God is the ultimate authority, and God wrote the Bible through people. Is that about right?
He is the omnipresent God. He is the all-knowing God, the omniscient God, that is. He is the God who's always been there. He knows all things. He has all power. He's omnipotent.
I think here is a good place to point out that the Bible is rather wishy-washy with these claims. Sometimes God is all-knowing, like in 1 John chapter 3, verse 20, where it plainly states that he knows everything. But other times it's possible to hide from God, like in Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 through 9. And then also in Genesis 3, God didn't know what had happened that led to Adam and Eve hiding from him. It wasn't until they told him that he knew. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God didn't know the extent to which the wickedness had taken hold in the cities, so he sent angels to scout it out for him, and even bargained with Abraham about how many righteous people there must be found before the cities could be spared. The apologetic for these is usually something along the lines of God acting as though he didn't already know something in order to give the person he's interacting with a chance to do the right thing and tell the truth. But the problem here is that if God is all-knowing, then he already knows whether or not his play acting will result in that person making the right choice. There is something to be said for the idea of letting the person actually do something wrong before punishing the wrong, but let's just think about the Adam and Eve story for a second with this in mind. They already ate the forbidden fruit. They were already hiding when God came down to the garden. When God pretended not to know they were there, they came right out, which is presumably the right thing to do in that situation. If God is all-knowing, he knew they would do the right thing in this instance before they did it, so why not just skip a step and go directly to where they were hiding? It gets even worse with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. If he is all-knowing, he knows in advance that all the people of Sodom are wicked and will end up being wiped out, except for Lot and his family. And he knows that Lot will do the right thing. The right thing in this case apparently being the act of offering up his daughters for gang rape. He could just whisk Lot and his family out of the city without any sort of test, since he already knows the outcome. Better yet, maybe destroy the wicked people in a more discerning manner. Don't just rain fire and brimstone down from above, just cause all the wicked people to die instantly with no need to evacuate Lot beforehand. Oh yeah. And Lot's wife gets killed because she has the audacity to look back at the city that was her home as it was being destroyed. That punishment clearly fit the crime. And then there's the bargaining with Abraham. What could possibly be accomplished by that? Abraham is not the one being tested here. If anyone is, it's Lot.
He is the God that is above all other gods easily. And so anytime there's some other alleged God, they cannot compete with the God of the Bible by any means, just by their very nature.
In other words, if I assume that a God exists, and I assume that this God is the most powerful of all the potential gods, and I assume that it is the God described by the Bible, then other religions can't be true because that would violate my assumptions. Is that about right?
So that right there should be one of the ways just to step back and say, okay, the God of the Bible is the supreme God, and we can have confidence in him in his revelation to man.
But how did you determine that the God of the Bible is the supreme God? Is it because the Bible says so? It's because the Bible says so, isn't it?
Now, what atheists will say is they'll say the Bible is a book of myths. And I hear these things and you hear them.
I certainly do agree that the Bible is a book of myths, but that is not my response to the claim that Christianity is more true than other religions because the Christian God is the supreme God. It is meant to question how you came to believe that your God is actually supreme.
But when you get into the substance of the claims, they will say the Bible is filled with contradictions. That is what they will say. How do you respond to that?
Before Bodie gives a response, let me just preface it by saying that even if every contradiction has a reasonable explanation, the existence of even apparent contradictions means that God was not powerful enough or knowledgeable enough to make a book that is good enough to stand on its own. Or he was, but he didn't want to give us an actual perfect book. I've heard the Bible called the instruction manual for life. Well, if I have an instruction manual that needs an entire catalog of other books to explain how to interpret the instruction manual, then that wasn't a very good manual to begin with. There are more books teaching you how to interpret the Bible than there are books in the Bible.
Yeah, well, first off, big picture. If somebody's going to object to God, who is the ultimate authority, by what authority can they do that?
If God really is the ultimate authority, then there shouldn't be a problem with him demonstrating that in a way that everyone could accept. The fact that he needs mere humans like you to tell other people that questioning his authority is wrong is indicative of his lack of actual authority.
They have no choice but to appeal to their own authority. So basically what they're saying is, we're going to demote God, elevate me to be God, just to oppose God and his word. Now that becomes a huge problem, because that is a faulty appeal to authority. They're appealing to man as being greater than God, and that right there in and of itself is fallacious.
And there we go. Bodie Hodge, master of misunderstanding logical fallacies, is at it again. Yes, an appeal to authority is not fallacious if that authority is actually a legitimate authority on whatever you're appealing to them for. For instance, when talking about biology, I will look up papers written by biologists and reference them as an authority on the subject because I have no authority there due to my complete lack of qualifications. When talking about evolution, most of my work is in tracking down the sources that creationists use to see if they're actually saying what the creationists say they are, and 99% of the time they are not. The other 1% of the time is when they are quoting other creationists. But here's the thing. In order to be considered an authority on something, you have to demonstrate that you deserve to be considered an authority. When you say that God is the ultimate authority, that is you making an assertion. If you want God to actually be considered an ultimate authority, you have to be able to demonstrate that he actually is. No authority is above questioning.
If you start with God and his word, contradictions are a bad thing, because God cannot deny himself. That's why God is not a contradictory being. So just from that perspective, to say a contradiction is wrong is actually a Christian principle.
Not really, it's more along the lines of you claiming that God cannot be a contradictory being, and then you go ahead and define him in a contradictory way. I'm not saying that contradictions are somehow objectively wrong here. I'm just pointing out that if you claim that there are no contradictions, then one single contradiction demonstrates that your initial statement is not true. And since 3 of the 4 omnis of God, depending on how you count them, are contradictory when compared to reality, God is either contradictory by nature or doesn't exist as you've defined him.
So when I see atheists say, oh, well, there's contradictions in the Bible, well, why are contradictions wrong in your worldview?
Now, I'm not sure if you're trying to attach some sort of negative moral value to contradictions, or if you're trying to say that the laws of logic don't apply without your God existing, but either way, you're wrong. Contradictions are not immoral, they're just not expected in a book that's supposed to be perfect. And if you want to claim that the laws of logic wouldn't exist without a God, then you have to demonstrate that somehow. I have never seen anyone make a convincing case that logic wouldn't exist without God. They just start with that as an assumption and proceed to laugh at the people who have the audacity to just not take their assumption at face value. I go more in depth on the laws of logic and their tenuous connection with the Bible when I responded to Jason Lyle, link in the little I in the corner.
From an atheistic perspective, they are materialists. Atheism is built on materialism. Basically, they say everything is material, there's no spiritual, there's no God.
Not all atheists are materialists. There are plenty that believe in some sort of spiritual realm. But yeah, they would all agree that there is no God.
Well, hold it. That means logic doesn't exist.
Why would the absence of a God mean that logic doesn't exist? Is there anything to suggest that the laws of logic need to be propped up by a God? Do you have any supporting evidence for this?
That means knowledge doesn't exist. That means truth doesn't exist. That means contradictions. Who cares? You see, from that viewpoint, they're being totally inconsistent just to try to argue against it.
How? I don't accept the claim that the source of logic is your God. You need to demonstrate the truth of this claim, or it is meaningless. The way I see it, the laws of logic are descriptive rather than prescriptive. We worked out the laws of logic as a way of describing how the universe works. If contradictions had turned out to be possible, we would have a different set of laws of logic that would also be descriptive. But as it turns out, contradictions are not possible, so that was incorporated into our descriptive laws of logic.
And one of the things that we point out right up front is to say that there's a contradiction is to assume a Christian worldview.
It's not possible for there to be contradictions in the Bible because in order for contradictions to exist, the Bible would have to be true. Is that your argument here? Well, as long as we're playing the dishonest logic game, allow me to just say that if biblical contradictions can't exist unless the Bible is true, then the absence of contradictions in the Bible demonstrates that the Bible can't be true because contradictions would only be there if it were true. Yeah, that doesn't actually make any sense, but it makes just as much sense as the junk that Bodie is rattling on about.
And what I've found is a lot of people, they don't understand what a contradiction is. A contradiction is, like A and not A in the same instance, in the same relationship.
So, for instance, if the Bible were to say that one specific person died by hanging himself in one spot, and in another spot saying that he died by tripping and falling on some sharp rocks that dashed his intestines out? Or, as another example, when Peter denies Jesus. In Matthew, the second person to ask him about Jesus was a servant girl, and in Luke it was someone who was undeniably identified as a man. Usually with contradictions of this nature, the apologetic is something along the lines of one book is just telling the story from a different perspective than the other one, so in this case it might be that he denied Jesus more than 3 times. But each book only talks about 3 instances, and each book makes it abundantly clear that it would happen exactly 3 times. This leaves no room for extra untold occurrences in the other books. So this is a situation where we have A and not A both being described as true, proposition A being that the second person asking Peter about his affiliation with Jesus was female. I mean, unless you're going to make the claim that this person was gender fluid and that's God's way of letting us know that that's a thing that exists, but somehow I doubt you'd approve of that interpretation.
And most people don't realize that. They, draw something else out and try to make a contradiction out of it.
They'll point to Genesis, the creation story, 2 different narratives of creation. Like, that's a big one.
That's one I hear all the time. Let me answer that one ever so briefly. Genesis 1, all the way up through Genesis 2:3, that's the order of creation. That's God creating everything in 6 days and resting on the 7th. You jump into Genesis chapter 2, what you're doing is you're honing in specifically on day 6 of creation. Yeah, there's a little setup to it, but that's really what it is. It's not a contradiction. It's not 2 separate accounts. It's jumping in to the details, and we see this quite commonly.
I can see how you might think that, but Genesis 1 does make it clear that animals were created before humans, and chapter 2 makes it clear that man was created before the animals, and woman was created after the animals. Also, apparently in one day, God paraded all of the animals past Adam in order for him to name them with this interpretation. Being generous and assuming that Adam only had to come up with names for animals at the kind level, and using AIG's number of 1,500 created kinds, that means that Adam would have had to name animals at a rate slightly faster than 1 animal per minute for an entire 24-hour day. And that's assuming that God created him and set him to work naming animals instantly, which is not the impression given by the story. You have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to get them to fit together, is what I'm getting at.
A good example to look at is Genesis 10 and 11. Genesis chapter 11, 1 through 9, is the chronological account of what happened at the Tower of Babel, or Babel, or however you want to say it. But you jump back to Genesis chapter 10, it's the breakdown of all those different families that came out with a different language.
In other words, for this to not be a contradiction, it has to be written backwards. Why not just put the Tower of Babel story first, and then follow it up with, and this is how the nations descended from Babel, rather than write out how the nations descended and explicitly state that they each had their own language, and then follow that with a proclamation that the whole earth had one language and the same words? If I, a mere mortal, and not even close to being an author of anything that could be remotely considered great literature, can come up with a better way of telling the story so that it's less confusing and not obviously contradictory than the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe, then what does that say about your all-knowing and all-powerful creator of the universe?
Why do we put our faith in believing this one book? And so for you, why do you put your faith in believing that one book?
Well, let's just start off with the fact that the Bible is true.
And there you have it. My book is the right one, not all the others, because mine is true. What evidence do you have for that? Well, if I do enough mental gymnastics to make a Cirque du Soleil performer dizzy, there are no contradictions. Now, I'm skipping all the stuff about other religions. It basically boils down to they either don't worship my God, so it's not the one true God, or in the case of Mormonism and Islam, they're copying from my religion, so mine is still the original. So it's a battle for which myth he likes best, and spoiler, it's the one that he decided in advance can't possibly be wrong because it's true. Because it is. No evidence needed.
Well, and we're told don't add or take away, right?
That's right.
And so with that question, one of the critiques is that, well, over the years, the Bible has had plenty added and taken away, and that we really can't trust it because it was hundreds of years, it was decades after Jesus that it was written. I mean, you've heard all of these things. When we look at the Bible and its writing and its composition and the way it was put together, can we have confidence that it hasn't been altered and it's been consistent since the early church?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, we can, he says. Well, Bodie, AIG's preferred translation of the Bible seems to be the ESV. In the ESV Bible, at the end of the book of Mark, you will see a little note warning the reader that the earliest manuscripts do not contain verses 9 through 20. Since the earlier copies of the books didn't have those verses, it can be inferred that those verses weren't in the original version of the book, which means they were added later. Clear evidence printed right in the Bible itself that changes were made. Now, I'm not saying that the books were changed drastically from the original written stories, but to say that they are unchanged and perfect is demonstrably wrong.
In fact, that's actually called a prejudicial conjecture. Most people who make that kind of a statement really hasn't studied the facts, they haven't studied the history on this.
Fact. If you use any modern translation of the Bible, it will come with a plethora of footnotes. These footnotes cover a wide range of topics, such as alternate translations, telling you where other verses in the text were referencing, but also the differences between manuscripts. Side note, is that why certain churches stick to the King James only, like the NIFB? Because the King James Version is public domain, there aren't a universal set of footnotes that comes with it, so it is possible to get it without footnotes. It's a lot easier to convince people that the book they have in their hands is perfect if that book does not contain a bunch of footnotes pointing out places where it isn't.
And what it is the Bible's text has really remained essentially the same. And one of the reasons we know that is we have a massive number of texts to look at. When it comes to just the New Testament alone, we have over 24,000 copies and fragments, about 5,000 copies just in Greek.
Ooh, yay, it's the argument from how many manuscripts there were. Huzzah! Well, you can click the I in the corner for my video dealing specifically with this topic. Just please, no comments about how the word manuscript literally translates to handwritten, and that's why the printing press copies don't count as manuscripts. I was pointing out that it is an arbitrary cutoff that artificially inflates the numbers when people talk about how many ancient copies of the text there are, as if something being a manuscript makes it a better piece of evidence than something shot off a printing press in the same year. Yes, I worded it sloppily, but it's already been corrected about 3,000 times in the comments. For the short version, we have no copies for the first 100 years after Jesus' death, and in the first 200 years we have a grand total of 8 tiny scraps of manuscripts. We don't get a single full copy of the whole New Testament until the 4th century, and after that the church was well established and had set up scriptoriums with monks whose only job day in and day out was to copy the Bible. And in a best-case scenario, all this means is that the copies we have today were fairly accurate copies of the originals, which we don't and probably never will have. It doesn't do anything to demonstrate the truth of what the books say.
Should people, the critique that it took decades to write the books, after Jesus, is that a concern?
I don't think the critique is that it took decades to write the books. I mean, this isn't George R.R. Martin we're talking about. I think the critique is that nothing was written down for decades, and when it finally was, it wasn't in the language that would have been spoken by the people in the story. So it is far removed from whatever the original story was, both temporally and culturally.
Well, actually, the apostles were directly involved in these. We have letters. For example, Paul signs off on some of these.
Right.
Yeah, Paul. A guy who never met Jesus when he was alive. Great attestation there. Surely Paul can accurately attest to the events that he never even claimed to have witnessed.
So Paul was definitely alive. So just because that's after, say, the resurrection of Jesus, after he ascended, it's not a big deal. The apostles are still around.
The only books of the Bible that are supposed to have been written by apostles are all books whose actual authors are unknown. A textual criticism will reveal that they are often written in a manner that suggests that the author has a formal education in rhetoric and philosophy, as well as being written in Greek and displaying an advanced knowledge of the Greek language. Both of these facts would be highly unusual for Galilean fishermen who spoke Aramaic, to say the least. The Gospels are all anonymous. The book of Luke states right at the beginning that it is a retelling of a story from other sources. There is nothing in the Bible to suggest that any of the apostles were directly involved in the writing of the New Testament.
At that particular time, they knew what the scripture was. So they were imposing this on the church. Now, it might have taken a little time for different churches to realize what all of those are, but by and large, that's not a problem at all.
Well, they're also spreading the church during those years.
Right.
So this critique that they didn't sit down and immediately write is kind of interesting.
Right.
To me.
The church is a result of the scripture, not the scripture a result of the church. And I know a lot of people have made that mistake.
I think it's actually more of a combination of the two. If you read the 4 Gospels back to back, you get the impression that they are different denominations making points specifically to disagree with the points being made by the other ones. Like when the Synoptic Gospels make it clear that Simon of Cyrene was made to carry Jesus' cross, but the author of John couldn't have that because his Jesus was fully God, not a fallible human being that God adopted as his son like in Mark. So if Jesus is God, he can't be weak, so he made a point of saying that he carried his own damn cross, thank you very much. And yeah, the fact that they didn't write everything down immediately is understandable given the time that they lived in, but it does call into question the reliability. When people are telling the story orally with the goal of making converts, the emphasis is on whether they will get the person you are talking with to convert, not on actually recalling all of the nitty-gritty details of the story, so a little exaggeration here and there is acceptable. Then, after 30-some-odd years of little exaggerations, we get our first written account of the life of Jesus. That is problematic to say the least.
One of the things that we've been asking people in this series is the critique that atheists will have of, well, where did God come from? So because once they're frustrated with the reality, in front of them, they'll sort of say, well, God, fine, you're saying God created all this. Well, who created God?
I love when people ask that question, who created God or where did God come from? Because it goes to show they don't actually know who the God of the Bible is.
Yes, you define God as having an eternal existence outside of space-time. We know. That's a response to the cosmological argument, which is basically that every effect has a cause, so to avoid an infinite regression, there must be a first cause, and that first cause is God. Why doesn't God have a cause? Because special pleading, that's why. Then the argument gets changed to everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore God. Except when it's reworded to eliminate the special pleading, it also eliminates the need for a God. Sure, the universe had a cause. Now please demonstrate that this cause is a God. Usually the apologist at this point will retreat into some rhetoric about how a creative mind had to do the creating, but that's just begging the question. I agree, the universe had to have a sufficient cause. I'm just intellectually honest enough to say that I don't know what that cause was, and I'm certainly not convinced that that cause needed to have a mind.
Well, we're not talking about a created God, we're talking about an uncreated creator.
Can you please demonstrate that such a thing is even possible? No, you can't. You have to start with the assumption that your God created everything, therefore nothing created your God.
He's the one who actually was the one who came up with time. In fact, I had a kid one time jump up in a class where I was speaking at, and he's like, well, where did God come from? And I asked him a very simple question. I said, what page of Shakespeare's book Hamlet do you find Shakespeare?
Well, we don't find him in the plays, but we do have his baptism and burial records. In other words, we have evidence outside of his books to demonstrate that he actually existed. And on top of it all, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is some question as to whether the William Shakespeare whose baptism and burial records we have was the same person who wrote the plays attributed to Shakespeare. This is dismissed by most historians of Shakespeare as a fringe belief without much supporting evidence, but my point is that your analogy to Shakespeare here demonstrates that some form of evidence outside of the works themselves needs to be considered before we can say for certain that he existed.
What for you is the single thing that proves a creator and that proves the Bible to be true? If you could point to one thing.
Well, what I would do is I would say that the Bible itself actually has the preconditions to make knowledge, truth, logic, and so forth possible. And so in light of that, if you start with God, then you have a basis to even answer that question. If not, you don't have any basis, you have no foundation to even answer that question.
Okay, so no actual evidence, just assertions. Where in the Bible does it actually have any sort of foundational knowledge that renders all other knowledge possible? I mean, it certainly says things that could be interpreted that way, but anyone can write a book that says that it is the foundation of knowledge. Writing it down does not make it true. You need to provide evidence to support that position before I'm willing to accept that idea.
Think of it this way. If we have to ask this question, how do we know the Bible's true? We're assuming certain things. We're assuming that knowledge exists. We're assuming that truth exists, and we're assuming that we're made in the image of someone that can actually answer that question.
I can tentatively agree with the first 2 points there with how the question was phrased, but where in that question does it even begin to hint at an assumption that we are made in anyone's image? And why does being made in someone's image have any bearing on whether or not a question could be answered?
Okay, if we're just rearranged chemicals, everything is material, knowledge and truth don't exist, so you automatically can't even really answer that question if you're consistent with it.
That depends entirely on how you define knowledge and truth. I'll link Topologia's videos on knowledge and truth without God, but essentially truth comes down to how accurate something is when compared to reality, and knowledge comes down to how accurate our understanding of something is when compared to reality. Neither of these concepts requires a God. If a God exists, then that will be part of the truth of reality. His existence is independent of the concepts of knowledge and truth.
Now, when we get around the issue of the contradictions, because that's one place they'll go, they'll also start pointing to very specific scriptures that they find objectionable or issues that they think the Bible condones. And many times context is lost in these discussions. Genocide is a big area. They say the Bible condones genocide, the Canaanites, and you can go down the line. And then slavery. The Bible condones slavery. How have you responded to those sorts of critiques?
Well, in a secular view, why not do those things?
So you start off by dodging the question completely. Nice. Okay, let me explain it to you in small words. In a secular view, we are a social species. We do better as a social species when we play nice with each other. Genocide and slavery are not playing nice. They greatly increase suffering in the world with only a relatively tiny increase in happiness. Because we are beings with empathy, we understand that other people's suffering is not good because we don't want to suffer. So it is best if we try to minimize suffering.
Those things are wrong from a biblical viewpoint, and what it is they're not understanding the Bible properly.
Okay, if those things are wrong from a biblical viewpoint, then it should be no trouble for you to point to the verse where God commands you plainly and clearly to not own other people as property and to not wipe out entire civilizations. Shouldn't be any trouble whatsoever, should it?
The punishment for sin is death. See, God is a God of life. If people want to oppose God and they want to say, hey, God, I want to have a life without you, what they're saying is they want death. And that's really what happens. When we, as human beings, sin against God, going all the way back to Adam, we continue to sin, really what we're saying is we want a life without God. Now, God stepped into history to save us from that, where he took that punishment upon himself. But let's just look at some of those specific instances. The flood is a great example of that. Here we are sitting right outside by where the ark is. We're at the ark encounter. The flood's a great example. The people before the flood were being judged for their sin. They were violent. They were killing. Every thought was evil all the time. There's probably rampant child sacrifice, rape, all sorts of terrible things were going on. God was very patient with them. He gave them a countdown to repent, and they didn't do it. But you know what? 8 people were saved from that flood. So the Lord did send a means of salvation. All you had to do is go through the door of the ark to be saved. What about, we'll say, with the Canaanites? The Israelites were going to go in and judge the land of Canaan. They were doing horrible sin. A lot of that's listed in Leviticus chapter 18. They were having sex with their parents. For example, they were sacrificing their children. They were doing all sorts of horrible things. And the Bible said, hey, you guys are going to be judged. And that's what the Lord did. He sent the Israelites in. But guess what? Rahab was saved out of that. So was her whole family. Why? Because she repented and turned to God. Here's what we see consistently throughout the Old Testament, even in the New Testament. When people were being judged, there was a means of salvation from that. And what that relates to the gospel today. We're all going to stand before God and give an account for our sin. And all of us, by right, should be judged as guilty. So how is it that any of us are going to get saved? By the blood of Jesus.
Okay, so no verse that actually condemns those things, but several examples of God committing and commanding genocide. Nice. But it's okay, a tiny number of people were saved in those stories, so genocide is acceptable as long as you give a handful of people an escape route? That's what I'm getting out of this. And so far, nothing on the slavery issue. I can point you to verses that tell you how much you can beat your slaves, who you can take as slaves, how to sell your daughter into sex slavery, how to coerce an indentured servant into becoming a permanent slave, and orders for slaves to obey and respect their masters. I have never seen any verse in the Bible that just flat out says that it's wrong to own another human being as property. It all has to be inferred from other statements. So go ahead, Bodie, now that you've described why genocide is occasionally a moral thing to do, either explain how slavery back then wasn't as bad as American slavery, as if that somehow makes it moral, or explain why slavery is okay. Go on.
And that was a very harsh form of slavery. In fact, what I would say when it comes to the Americas, with a lot of the African slave trade, or in Europe with the African slave trade, a lot of that is a very harsh form of slavery. However, the Bible talked about a different form of slavery because the Bible actually allowed a form of slavery. And a lot of times people want to call it servitude. But what it was, if someone was lost to debt and they couldn't pay their debt, they could sell themselves into slavery. And when they would sell themselves into slavery, basically that richer person would cover their debt, give them a place to stay, give them an education so that when they came out they had a proper trade that they could be doing. They actually got paid a very small wage. And after 6 years, they were to be released. It was actually a 7-year contract, but the 7th year, they were allowed to go free at that stage so they could be a productive member of society.
Yes, that is the indentured servitude version of slavery in the Bible. I suspect you're dressing it up to make it look a little nicer than it actually was, but certainly the indentured servitude version was nowhere near as bad as being a slave in 19th century United States. But why would that make it moral? That was only applicable to the men. The women were permanent slaves, and should a man marry while he was in his period of servitude, his family would remain slaves even after he was freed. His only way of remaining with his family was to declare that he wanted to be a slave for life and have his ear pierced with an awl as a sign of his position. But those are the rules for Hebrew slaves. Foreign slaves are your property forever, and you can do with them as you wish, with the exception of beating them to death. You can beat them so harshly that they can't walk for a few days because they're your property. Yeah, this sounds like a totally moral system here. Why couldn't the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God of everything have told these people that, hey, I know it's common practice in your area at the moment, but owning other human beings is a bad thing. Don't do it. Show the world my mercy and love by freeing your slaves and not taking any more slaves from this day forth. Had Israel been the only nation in the area at that time that outlawed slavery, that would have made the Bible look a whole lot better today. Surely God would have known that, right?
That's actually a brilliant thing. It's actually better than bankruptcy if you think about it. But that's really what it was. It was actually a voluntary thing. Now, there were issues, with regards to war and that sort of thing too. But that type of slavery is much different than what we saw in the Americas.
The chattel slavery of ancient Israel was technically different than the chattel slavery seen in the Americas. Therefore, the Bible is a perfectly moral book. Nah, man, how about you just don't own other people as property? It's a rather simple concept, but no, if you want to argue that the Bible is the perfect moral authority on everything, then you have to find some way to justify slavery and make it seem moral, because the Bible is definitely pro-slavery.
In fact, slavery is wrong because the Bible actually forbids it. You're not allowed to go kidnap someone. In the Old Testament, if you kidnap someone to be your slave, that was actually an offense punishable by death.
Yes, in Exodus 21:16, you are forbidden from kidnapping a man with the punishment being death. However, in Leviticus 25:44 through 46, it explicitly states that you are allowed to take slaves from the pagan nations around you, and you're allowed to take as slaves the children of foreigners who live among the Hebrews. So either these are two contradictory verses, or the verse in Exodus 21 was referring only to the Hebrews. Either way, it's not a good look.
You see, so a lot of people confuse what is biblical slavery versus the harsh slavery. Christians, and from a Christian viewpoint, the harsh slavery is definitely wrong.
Yeah, when the Bible people owned slaves, they only beat them to within an inch of their lives, not all the way dead. Aside from that, it was pretty good when compared to American slavery. Therefore, biblical slavery is perfectly moral.
Well, you have numerous examples. You have the Hebrews being delivered from slavery after hundreds of years. You have Philemon and the instructions of how to treat the slave there.
Right.
So there's a lot of other examples that do not fit the narrative that they framed around this.
Right.
God had his chosen people freed from slavery, and one time Paul wrote a letter asking Philemon to free one of his slaves. Therefore, all the times when the Bible tells you how to acquire permanent slaves and how much you're allowed to beat your slaves don't count. Well, guess what? In Virginia in 1782, they freed the slaves that had fought for the colonies in the American Revolutionary War. So clearly American slavery, at least in Virginia, wasn't all that bad, right? I found an example of a whole bunch of slaves being set free. And when they freed the slaves who fought in the Revolution, they also made it legal for slave owners to free their slaves without having to first petition the state legislature for manumission. Slavery in Virginia must have been so good and moral.
And now think of this too, with regards to, all of us, we're seen as either slaves of sin or slaves of Christ.
So Jesus owns his followers as slaves, and that's supposed to be a nice image? On that note, that's essentially the end of the video. It's amusing to me how much post hoc rationalization has to be done to make the Bible seem like a moral book. I think Bodie here actually believes that slavery is wrong, but he had to find some way to make it look like it could be morally permissible, because he decided that the Bible is morally perfect, and the Bible clearly allows chattel slavery, at least in some circumstances. It certainly never overtly speaks out against the practice. So Bodie, who has more modern morals than the authors of the Bible, had to pick and choose which verses to focus on as being more important in order to try and make biblical morality match up with his modern morality. He is borrowing modern secular morality and applying it to his Christian worldview. Today's comment of the day comes to us from I gotta start looking at these names before I choose the comments. Who says, my response to the issue of abiogenesis not being completely understood is this. If abiogenesis were a completely understood field where the path that life took as it began to exist was completely certain, would that cause them to reject their faith in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior? If not, then why are they holding up a gap in the knowledge as proof of God's existence when they acknowledge that it is irrelevant to their faith? It's almost like a talking point instead of a relevant argument. Exactly. If abiogenesis were demonstrated to be completely true and understood, Christians would still be Christian. So why even bother with the God of the gaps? If that gap is filled scientifically, it will not affect your belief, so maybe choose a different hill to die on? So remember to follow me on Twitter and Facebook and support me on Patreon. See you next time.